Welcome back to the Green Lectionary Podcast, a production of Creation Justice Ministries. The Green Lectionary is a conversation on Scripture through the lens of creation justice. My name is Derek Weston, Director of Theological Education and Formation at Creation Justice Ministries, and today we will be looking at a pair of texts for Ash Wednesday as we begin our Lenten journey. My guests today are Reverend Dr. Shannan Vance-Ocampo, Executive Presbyter of the Presbytery of Southern New England, and Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter, author of The Spirit of Soul Food, Race, Faith, and Food Justice, and pastor of The Loft at Westwood UMC in Los Angeles. Before we begin our episode, I want to share the launch of this year's annual resource. Every year, Creation Justice Ministries produces a resource on a particular issue, encouraging congregations to find ways to engage it. This year's resource is The Power of God, From Extractive Theology to Transforming Faith. In it, we discuss theological notions of power, just transitions to renewable energy, and stories of churches using their collective power for the sake of community. The resource also includes elements for worship, including 7 original songs. You can download the resource at www.creationjustice.org/powerofgod. Join us now as we look at Joel and Matthew through the lens of creation justice. Our text for today is Joel chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, and 12 to 17. Blow the trumpet in Zion, sound the alarm on my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. It is near. A day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness. Like blackness spread upon the mountains, a great and powerful army comes. Their like has never been from of old, nor will be again after them in ages to come. Skipping to verse 12. Yet even now, says the Lord, return to me with all your heart, with fasting and weeping and with mourning. Rend your hearts and not your clothing. Return to the Lord your God. For God is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, and relenting from punishment. Who knows whether God will not turn and relent and leave a blessing behind God, a grain offering and a drink offering for the Lord your God. Blow the trumpet in Zion, consecrate a fast, call a solemn assembly. Gather the people, consecrate the congregation, assemble the aged, gather the children, even infants at the breast. Let the bridegroom leave his groom and the bride her canopy. Between the vestibule and the altar, let the priests, the ministers of the Lord, weep. Let them say, spare your people, O Lord, and do not make your heritage a mockery, a byword among the nations. Why should it be said among the peoples, where is their God? So, where is creation in this passage?
Everywhere.
That is the most common answer to that question, by the
I'm
way.
well, you're dealing with real life circumstance, and I think just even from the beginning, you know, the first couple of verses where it's talking about, mountains and land trembling, and I think, one thing for your listeners to know. So I am in Los Angeles. I live, oh man, I live on the west side, so I was about 5 miles from the Palisades fire, maybe 7 miles from the Sunset
Mm,
fire. And
yeah.
so, when I first read this, Derek, I'll be honest, the first 2 verses really brought me back to um, the fires. I mean, that's like, we're literally where it says like blow, sound the alarm, like the alarms I was getting on my
Mm,
phone about what's happening. A day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness, and I'm just reminded of the realities of what happened in my community, right? And as we're recording this, it is in mid-February, and it's been raining here for a few weeks, so things are the fires are contained. But for several weeks prior to this, I mean, we had such a dry season um, that it was not, I won't say it was unexpected. Obviously, no one ever expects something like that to happen, but just living with the reality of it in the day to day, engaging. And I think one of the things that something a natural disaster like this does is it really humbles human beings, right?
mm,
You realize, like, how much control we don't have. As much as technology as we have, as much resources as we have to try to actually control and contain something like this, um, we can. And I think to an extent, those kind of humbling um, events right? Those things that help us understand that as much as we like to place ourselves in this kind of a hierarchy with respect to creation in terms of control, that's not
Mm.
always the case. And more often, we need to see ourselves as trying to work with creation. And so when I look at this text, the first couple of verses in Joel, especially, or what we're discussing this today, is it just reminded me of just that reality, how pervasive and how powerful it can be, and how it felt like. I mean, it felt like an army. I mean, it felt like just an army of fire coming through. Um, so the so that really kind of resonated with me in terms of where I saw creation in the text, in terms of how that disaster really kind of engulfed my community.
Yeah, I'm grateful, Christopher, for you bringing that up. It's I live on the East Coast, and so watching this from afar, but I also had family and grew up spending my summers in California as a kid, and so and being there for Christmas this time of the year, so I'm aware of what those Santa Ana winds are. I remember them from my childhood. Um, last 2 summers ago, we had the wildfires in Canada, here in the eastern part of Canada, and even here in upstate New York, the sky went orange. Um, and the last time I saw the sky that color was on 9/11, when I was just outside of New York City and trying to find all the members of our church that were in the towers and in other places in the financial district in my first call in ministry. So, um, that orange sky is really upsetting to me when I see it now. And I've seen it twice, and once because of, all the junk that came out of the towers, all the pollutants, and those were all, pollutants from buildings. And then pollutants from just even like a faraway forest fire, like up in Canada, like what it did to the sky here. I remember one day it was so orange, the sky, when the fires were going in Canada, and I took the dog out, and I had to come in after like 3 minutes because I had gone outside. And I don't know if this happened to you, Christopher, but I had like a blinding headache. And I'm sure I was thinking about that watching the fires in California because, we're much further away here than you all were. So you must have had some of that physiological stuff going on. Um, uh, and also, so interesting about Joel is, this passage comes right after a plague of locusts. And I remember reading some exegetical stuff about locusts. We think like locusts, like, oh, some grasshoppers today, and that's not what the locusts used to be like. It's like what they used to like when you read the Little House on the Prairie books, like as a kid, like if you ever read those books, like they had locusts in those books. And they like really like, they like darkened out the whole sky. Like you couldn't see the sun. Like there were gazillions of them. They really, they took out everything, and they ate everything. And so their disaster was not just like the sun had been blotted out, which must have been scary, but also all the crops had been eaten. And this was a subsistence society. And so once the crops are gone, it's not like you can go down the street to the grocery store and pick up some more. So I was thinking
Yeah,
about that.
I think, so we had to actually evacuate to San Diego. So we were in San Diego for a week, and
Mm,
our house is fine. Everything was, broadly speaking, fine. But in terms of like just the physical reactions, right, in terms of headaches and things of that nature, just couldn't exercise because of just, the smoke and like I
yeah.
said, the pollutants. And so that was definitely a visceral, something you could feel. Like, so your
Hmm.
body was carrying that, like the weight of the fires that were still burning. I
Mm,
think another thing that I kind of thought of as I was speaking, or just I had referred to it as a natural disaster, and yet, because I understand fires are natural, that's a part of what can happen with lightning strikes and things of that nature, in the way in which we engage non-human nature. But
hmm.
this obviously is a consequence of a combination of lots of things, but climate
Hmm.
change and Santa Ana winds, right? Like
Hmm.
we're so dry, right? Like it's
Yes.
in, and it is, we have overbuilt so much of that part, especially the Palisades.
Right.
Um, and so we put ourselves in positions to experience harm. And so when I think about where I see creation in this text, I don't neatly distinguish between creation and human beings, because we are created. But when I look at it in light of what Joel is suggesting and arguing, I see both this kind of way in which where it says the inhabitants and the land tremble, right? Like I just saw that and I just thought, man, this is so prescient. Like it is so
Mm-hmm.
relevant right now in terms of just the visceral reaction of what everything, yeah, you so
Mm-hmm.
how so much was happening at one time, and so for me, as I see this passage, I think about where I see creation. The initial part is just this way in which you are supposed to just be present and notice what's happening. And so it's kind of like what you were just saying in terms of just knowing about the locust, Shannon, and just being like actually paying attention and saying like we can't when we read these passages so often we have to um, try to place ourselves in the context of agricultural farmers, right? To be like, hey, like we don't understand. Like actually, when locusts came, it was a big deal because we didn't have other sources of light and we didn't have other sources of food
Mm-hmm.
that we could go to. And so this was a when this plague happened for them, it was fundamentally disruptive. Similarly, I think now I will
Mm-hmm.
never read a passage in scripture that talks about darkness and fire ever the same ever again.
Mm,
Like
Right.
I will not because of
Mm-hmm.
because of this experience. And so
Mm-hmm.
in a sense, it gives me a certain kind of exegetical insight to kind of
Mm-hmm.
correlate a little bit to what they were talking about and what they're trying to allude to, because this is obviously talking about the end times. You know, it's trying to say this
Yeah.
is what happens in the second coming, and it felt like that. It felt very apocalyptic. For me and my family. And you have a
Mm-hmm.
5-year-old son, and so that this was his first like kind of, um, you know, really wrestling with like death,
mm,
because I think that
Mm-hmm.
was something like he was mindful of because you could see,
Mm-hmm.
well, what happens if our house catches on, wanting to feel safe, um, and
mm,
so yeah, I think again, for me when when I look at this text, I see creation, I see tension, I see groaning, I see, um, and
Mm-hmm.
yet when you get to the next question, which we can get to whenever, like I do see some another a pull there for non-human nature as well.
Yeah.
mm,
And I also want to say about this passage, because, folks who are listening to this are going to be preparing to, lead worship or preach or teach Bible study or something as they get going into Lenten practices in their communities. And there's a real temptation with a passage like this to read, um, to have this, theology of God the Punisher, and the deserving punishment, and this angry, violent God, violent, abusive. There's this in here, and I want to just lift up. I have been using uh, Dr. Will Gaffney's lectionary books on womanist lectionaries that she's done. She's published for all 3 years plus an additional year of a women's year. And she points out, she says it would be important to unravel the blame language, is what she says about this
mm,
passage. And that a disaster doesn't equal punishment. A disaster is just a disaster. And I think it's also, it's interesting because, we think about the original community as being that agricultural agrarian community, right? It really was just a disaster or just bad luck of this was the year the locusts decided to go bonkers and eat everything and destroy all the
mm,
food. But for us, you've got the natural thing of the Santa Ana winds, right, in California, as we talk about these wildfires. That's normal, that's natural. Forest fires are actually a good thing. In when, before we got involved in them, in the normal course of things, they were good. They cleansed the forest, new things got birthed, grew. It wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but as you said, Christopher, we've gotten involved in Southern California. We being, human beings, we being capitalism, right? And so built all these houses where there shouldn't be houses, overbuilt, um, created water systems that don't really completely work for everybody. Add on to that climate change and the climate crisis, and now the weather is unnatural, and that area of California didn't get water for 8 months. You got what, like a half an inch of water in 8 months? That was like the total precipitation, something crazy like that. And then you get these winds and it's bone dry and the winds are bigger. And so I think we can easily go into some of that space of like, oh, this is because God's punishing us because we've harmed the earth or we've abused the earth or we've mistreated the earth. And that slips real easy into some other really bad theology that's been going on about this was because of DEI, or this was because the mayor's a black woman, or the fire chief is a lesbian, right? Like that feeds into that bad theology. And so like that's the string that's getting pulled by some of the folks out in the media. And I just I want to be clear out of my tradition in the Christian tradition, like that's not good theology. That's not correct theology. And it might be worth it to a preacher to sort of signal and name that and to try to tease out these things of how do we repent for the sinfulness that we have done of disrespecting the gift of creation. That is sin. But also God didn't burn down all of Altadena because of that. Like there's like how do you like that's a big thing to tease out. You might not get to that all in one sermon, but it's a definite if I was preaching, that'd be a definite tension for the preacher and to also name the evil of using bad theology to blame this on like just like because of the color of the skin or the sexual orientation of those who happen to be in leadership. Like that's all bad. I just want to name that.
It's really good that you do that. And I want us to think about how we don't do blame, but we
Right.
do think about consequences, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And so one of the things that I was reading as I was preparing for this is and there's theories and all sorts of things out there, but one of the things I read was that it's possible that we can't get plagues of locusts without monoculture,
Mm-hmm.
without large swaths of monoculture. And so there may
Mm-hmm.
have even been a part of the economy, the
Interesting.
extraction of the economy of
Mm-hmm.
the people of Israel at the time
Yep.
that was not the right use of the land, that was
Mm-hmm.
inviting the locusts in. And there
Mm-hmm.
still might have been a connection here to injustices of the people,
Mm-hmm.
misuse of the land. Again, there's a lot of questions around that, but um, would locusts have been attracted to large swaths of land that were just one thing, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to the diversity of
Yeah.
crop rotations and the ways that we think about regenerative agriculture now? So
Yeah.
yes, let's not do blame, particularly not the ways that we've seen blame done in the past, where we have seen some really harmful theologies. And
Mm-hmm.
especially as we're going into Lent, thinking about consequences, thinking about
Yeah.
consequences of our action, and the ways in which we interact with creation might have a consequence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think for me, this is where I think it's helpful to go into the next question of
Mm,
where is humanity interacting with creation in the text for good or for
Mm-hmm.
harm? And I think this is the tension when you do good theology of understanding accountability. And I think
mm,
Mm-hmm.
this is the challenge
Mm-hmm.
um, with all people of faith. It should be right where we are trying to swim in the waters of accountability, knowing that
mm,
this is a baptism that will lead you to liberation, is what I
mm,
say, because accountability is something that um, we have tried to dodge, whether it be through race and racism. White supremacy is a form of not taking accountability for the history of what's happened. Patriarchy is a form of not taking accountability for the history of what has happened with respect to power dynamics, and the same thing with anthropocentrism, right? So we have to take accountability for the actions that has happened, and this is where you look at the parable, of scattering the seeds where you reap what you sow, and I think this is we have
Mm-hmm.
sown. Um, some seeds clearly with respect to how we are engaging
Mm-hmm.
with the non-human nature in ways that can lead to harm, not in
Mm-hmm.
immediate but in the long term.
Mm-hmm.
It can, and I think this is where we have to so to me, when I look at this passage in Joel and I see that kind of space, I when I yeah, I see an opportunity, an invitation to shift and to change. And I
Mm-hmm.
think using the language that y'all were referencing earlier, I think can be helpful here. If I were preaching on this text, one of the things I think is really helpful, and it doesn't necessarily happen often in progressive congregations, or even, I don't even say just moderate congregations, is really making sure we understand, have a more nuanced understanding of sin. I think a lot of people talk about sin, but they actually don't define it well. We have a lot of bad understandings and definitions of sin, and I really like um, there's a text. Oh shoot, it's actually right behind me because I got my bookshelf right here. But there's a theologian, Roman Catholic theologian, that defines sin as a failure to bother to love. And what I appreciate about that, he's really looking at Jesus's examples of sin, one of which we're going to talk about here actually in a few moments in Matthew. And it's often when we literally, whether it be the Good Samaritan, and we fail to bother, like the priest and Levite failed to bother to do the thing that they couldn't honestly do. And in this sense, is when do we fail to bother to actually love creation more than we, as much as we love ourselves, right? Like literally, like where we give ourselves an inordinate love and overbuild things rather than recognizing that a deep love of self requires in its very nature that we care for non-human nature so that we actually can flourish, right? Like, so have an appropriate amount of love rather than an inordinate amount of love. And so that's where I see Joel, the invitation where where the prophet says in verse 12, "Yet even now, says the Lord, return to me with all your heart, with fasting, with weeping, and with mourning. Rend your hearts and not your clothing." Like that's the one that got me. It's like rend your hearts. This is where it's like, do as I see this, when I see where humanity is interacting with creation, this is the invitation, right?
Mm-hmm.
To actually practice what you preach in ways that are authentic rather than the performative kind of stuff that happens often with environmental justice or creation
Mm-hmm.
care, right? Where you say the right things, you post the right stuff, but how do you actually live your life as the leader of this congregation, as the leader in your family, as the lead, how do you actually live? Like not your clothes, rend your heart. I don't want to see the external stuff. Internally, how have you been shaped and are changing in light of what's happening? And so for me, this is where I see like the invitation with respect to where humanity and creation are interacting, right? Where you can see this tension between, okay, what does it mean for me to take seriously this understanding of sin as a failure to love, to then actually love creation. So that kind of gets in, I guess, maybe to questions 2 and 3 a little bit, but for me, this is how I kind of see that verse as this kind of turn in to how we engage non-human nature, but then also what we ought do in light of that.
It's so interesting at the end of this passage in Joel, this piece of it. The last two sentences are, "Fear not, O land, be glad and rejoice, for the Holy One has done great things. Fear not, O animals of the field, for the pastures of the wilderness are green. The tree lifts up its fruit, the fig tree and the vine give their riches." And yeah, I want to lift up Dr. Gaffney again. She says about this, she says it's notable that God addresses the earth and her creatures in verses 21 and 22. Um, and she writes, God cares for them. This is a direct quote from her. God cares for them, and whether humanity repents or not, God will care for them. And so, another really interesting thread to pull on here for preaching of, um, is God gonna what's God going to save, right? Is God going to save the creation, or is God going to save us? There was another piece I was reading recently that, the animals and the earth don't need us, but we sure need it. And we sure need them.
I love
You
that.
know,
I love that. That's when I was like, yes, this
yeah.
is it. Please keep going. I just want to let you know
Yeah.
how much I
No, no,
appreciate.
no,
Like,
thank
yeah,
you.
like this is it. This is it.
No, I mean, we'd be gone without the earth, without creation, without the animals, without the plants, without the fungi, without all that stuff. We'd be cooked in about 24 to 48 hours, right? But if we weren't here, they'd just continue on in their happy way. having normal forest fires, right? You know, all the things, right? So I think, you know, there's just some real interesting pieces to pull on, and it's Ash Wednesday is the beginning of a season of repentance. And so it's not just you wrestle with it once, because these are huge things. You can't complete all these issues in one sermon or one Bible study or one adult ed or whatever in a church. But it's an invitation to really maybe say, how serious do you want to be this Lent in wrestling with these things, in thinking about the nuances of sin and repentance and punishment and evil, um, the climate crisis. Like these are all big things, right? So how do we want to wrestle with them as a community? Your last question about this text, Eric, you know, where is there a call to action for the church? For me, it feels like with the Joel passage, the call to action for the church is to be the church and to wrestle and to be a community that does discernment and real theological work that's rooted in repentance, and to really dig in for a season and think about these hard things so that we can be new somehow, so that we can act newly somehow and be new, not just say, oh, I'm new because, you know, Jesus cleaned me of all my sins, right? Like, and I'm washed and I'm clean. Like that's not it to me. Like it is like, how are you showing up? What are you about? What are you doing? How are you trying to interact? And also I think in this really fraught time that we're in, you know, how we show up is always important, but it's even more important, especially in Christian communities, to define who we are, because it's being defined for us constantly, going back to, you know, this, you know, harmful theology of, you know, LA deserved this because of who the mayor is and who the fire chief is, right? I mean, that's just ridiculous. But I have lots of words for that, but I'll say that's ridiculous. But that's a theology that's out there, and a lot of people are really captive to it. And so I think this pulls up some great pieces for Lent, and also what's our relationship to the creation that is holy and beautiful and sacred all on its own and does not need us for its flourishing. Like what, when we're so used to everything revolving around us as human beings.
Yeah. Just a side note, I want to point out, as we often do here, that you are not bound by the verses that the lectionary gives you, because I actually feel like we thank you for
Sure.
bringing in that piece, Shannan, because we actually get something that I think is more helpful for thinking about creation justice when we extend into
Hmm.
those verses, particularly looking at verse 21 and verse 22,
Hmm.
like those where God is actually pouring out God's love for the soil and for the animals and for the
Hmm.
pasture and for the trees, and saying that's actually the thing that's turning God's heart,
Hmm.
is are those things, those non-human parts of creation, are actually what's turning God's heart towards restoring the people, not
Hmm.
anything that they do. So thank you for bringing that into the conversation.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
think that's some of the point of how Dr. Gaffney sets these books up. She says it in the introduction. I'm like her free promoter today for her 4-book series, but she did not pay me for this. But she says she wants to kind of deal with issues like this in the lectionary and pull it apart and expand it in some spaces and diminish it in others, right? And really deal with some of the harm that's set up in the way the lectionary is organized, and start to sort of renew some of that by some of this work. So I've found it to be helpful, and you know, I always in my preaching prep try to read pretty widely, and this has become one of my first go-tos recently. So that's why I'm kind of harping on it a little bit right now.
Well, you certainly have sold it to me because I had not heard it. So I'm like, there'd be one more set of books that will get purchased. I was like, oh, this is great. I will have to get that. So I can
Here's one
definitely recommend that.
right
Yeah, no,
here.
that's amazing.
Yeah, she's
Um,
great.
Derek, if it's okay, I wonder if we might shift, Shannon, if you're ready to
Yeah,
to Matthew
to
passage,
Matthew.
because I do
Sure.
think I know both of us found something relevant to say out of both these passages, and
Hmm.
I for one, love being able to use complementary passages that I think help us get at deeper issues. And
Hmm.
fortunately, I think uh, the lectionary for this week provides us an opportunity, ample opportunity actually to do that work.
Mm.
Yeah, let's do that. So the second passage is Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 to 6, 16 to 21. Beware of practicing your righteousness before others in order to be seen by them, for then you have no reward from your Father in heaven.
Mm.
So whenever you give alms, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may be praised by others. Truly, I tell you, they have their reward. But when you give alms, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your alms may be done in secret, and your Father in heaven who sees in secret will reward you. Whenever you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, so that they may be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward. But whenever you pray, go into your room and shut the door, and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Whenever you fast, do not look somber like the hypocrites, for they mark their faces to show others that they are fasting. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so your fasting may be seen not by others, but by your Father who's in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Do not store up for yourselves treasure on earth where moth and rust consume, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also.
Mm.
And so for me, when I saw that and I thought about, or when I read this and I'm thinking about the questions, where is creation in this text? I actually was really, and Shannon, you actually started me, or you kind of moved us towards this a little bit, even with your previous two answers. It was about consumption and capitalism. And so
Mhm.
specifically, verse 19, where it says, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust consume and where thieves break in and steal. But store your treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes, and where thieves do not break in and steal. And I see creation in this passage, in a space where it's wrestling with the realities of the kind of capitalism we practice, knowing which it's harms creation, right? Where we are trying to literally extract to overproduce, right? I mean that whole the idea of
Mhm.
consumption, we are consuming something that's coming from somewhere, and the raw materials, the goods and resources that comes from our planet, and so for me, again, it's this way in which I see how, particularly in our current context where we are dealing with you know, administration that doesn't necessarily want to take seriously the realities of climate change and the realities of environmental injustice, if you will. Um, you know, we can easily go down this path of continuing to make some of the same mistakes that we've been making with respect to the kind of consumptive practices that we have. And I think Lent,
Mhm.
this is an opportunity. I mean, when I grew up, like this was a time of Lent when you're supposed to give up something, right? You're supposed to like stop doing something, and I have, as I've matured, rarely do I give up something as much as more I try to add a practice that I think I actually want to sustain for me personally.
Mhm.
I'm not a person that's like, I'm not going to eat something. I'm like, well, I try to do that anyway. But it is a time where I'm like, okay, I'm going to get up and make sure that I spend a certain amount of time praying or journaling or doing something I think is going to deepen my faith. And I think discerning, why we can be drawn to consumption for you, like for you as an individual, right? Like giving your congregation that invitation to do this kind of work, because capitalism and this kind of consumption, it preys on this idea that if we buy this thing or have this next thing, that we will feel satisfied and complete and full, and it never is enough. Like it
Mhm.
never is enough, and it relies on it not being enough, right, for you to keep coming back. And so, not until you do the inner work to say, what is it that I'm actually trying to heal or get at or fix within
Mhm.
me, like through goods, you have to do that work internally to figure out, okay, that what I actually long for, I cannot purchase. It is relationship, it is love, it is whatever it is for you. But this is the opportune time to begin to do that kind of work, right? So
Mhm.
that we can begin to have a healthy relationship with creation rather than that kind of extractive one that this passage, I think, really kind of elucidates for us.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot packed into this passage about you could preach a whole sermon on extraction and all of that. And then at the front end of the passage, you could preach a whole sermon going back to what you were talking about earlier, Christopher, about performative actions and the lure of performative actions, which is, I think, such a lure for us. I mean, social media just, demands that we're performative all the time, right? And that everybody sees what we're doing. And like how do actions that you take, how are they for you? What's the balance between secret and private or public? um I went back when I was thinking about this passage and looked through some old sermons, because when I served in local churches, of course, I got to preach every year on Ash Wednesday. And my last sermon that I preached before I went into judicatory work, where I don't get to preach anymore on Ash Wednesday, which I kind of miss. So thank you, Derek, for giving me a chance to just sort of, yak away here about my thoughts. But my last sermon that I preached about Ash Wednesday, I was ruminating on this beginning piece, and talking about, it's sort of interesting that we have church on. What I said to the congregation was, it's sort of interesting. We're having this Ash Wednesday service in the evening, and we're going to put ashes on everybody's foreheads, and you're going to go home, and it's all secret, right? You're probably just going home after this. It's going to be dark. You're not going out, you're not doing stuff. But isn't it interesting, people that go to church early in the morning on Ash Wednesday get ashes on their forehead, and then they are walking around all day with the ashes on their forehead. And people notice that they're engaged in a religious practice, or maybe they notice that their coworkers, Christian that they never realized before, or and Christian enough to go to church on sort of the odd holiday, right? It's not big like Christmas, right? Ash Wednesday. And so, I mean, who wants to go to church on Ash Wednesday and talk about death and repentance and be told that you're dust and you're going to return to dust and you're going to die and be in the ground and be just with the worms? I mean, it's not a very exciting day in the Christian calendar for people that want to feel good, right? So, I said to the church, I said, it sort of bothers me. Like, maybe we should have church in the morning and people should see who we are. And maybe we should be performative, not performative about our faith, but more public about our faith, was what I was trying to push them to do, to be, to be a disciple in a way that tells people the truth of the Christian message and doesn't allow it to be usurped. And then I went back and read a commentary for this passage, thinking about today, which I wish I had had um, back in 2013 when I preached this sermon for 2013. Shannan, would have been helpful to have had this commentary, which is interesting because where they say, "Go to your room, and your God who is in secret will see you in that secret place." The commentator talks about this room is actually a public private room in homes in that time. That it wasn't like a completely private room the way we think about our bedrooms today, as like, you close your door and it's a private space, but that this was sort of like a room off the public space. And so even when people were praying in those places, everybody was very aware of what you were doing, and there was like movement in the house. And so it really was more of a, um you were praying, but you were also drawing people into your practice at the same time. And so I thought that was interesting to kind of think about the passage that way. Um, and what is our public action? If I was going to preach on this passage ecologically, I think I'd tell a little bit of a story about my garden. Derek knows this, but Christopher, I have this. We live on a corner house in a outside, just on the outskirts of a city, in the university part of the city. And I've been ripping up all my grass over the last 8 years slowly, and putting in pollinator gardens and vegetables, and now I have chickens. I've become the crazy lady on the corner. And um but my neighbors are over all the time checking it out. And I've now got like three of my other neighbors hooked on chickens for, eggs and stuff. And I've got other neighbors ripping up their garden, but I'm sort of like slowly evangelizing my neighborhood towards my ways, right? So maybe it is sort of I feel like my garden is a bit of a public prayer for my community, like what I would like to see. and how I want to heal the land around me. Because when we bought this house, it was just all grass and there was like a few shrubs. And now, like, all the animals have come back, and I didn't intend for them to be here, but now they're all here. And so, um, I wonder what that back and forth is at the front end of the passage of public, private. How do your prayers in public influence? When should you be performative in a good way, not in a bad way?
Now, I think I love the distinction between um, like performative and public in
Mhm,
our contemporary context, right? There's a way in which I do think. Now, I worked at a Roman Catholic institution for 8 years before I work. I'm a full time pastor, and so I'm an associate pastor at a church. So I do preach every Sunday, and also an associate professor at a university. So I work too much basically, but I
mhm,
digress. I think, but I said the Roman Catholic part because I would go to church in the morning because I had the opportunity because it was right on campus.
mhm.
And
Yeah.
our Roman Catholic priest, we had an Irish priest who was like super radicalized, like very, very just like, it helps you understand that the Irish were colonized. You're like, oh, this dude came from Ireland. And he got a certain attitude about oppression. He's very aware of
Mhm,
that. And so he would let me participate in ways that I know he wasn't supposed to, but he just was like, whatever, man, And so um, and I think it did draw a distinction. I think we're having it in the morning and then walk around during the day and people seeing it, giving them an understanding of, oh, it is making a kind of public declaration, but it's not, again, it's not performative. It is
mhm,
public. And I think when you look at this passage, I think that's ultimately what Jesus is talking about in terms of having this way of practicing your faith, but doing it from a place of authenticity rather than doing it from a place of performativity. Doing it
mhm,
not because you think other people are going to give you kudos or credit, but rather doing it because you understand that is what you are called to do and how you're called to practice. So similarly, when you're thinking about, um, at least for me, thinking about preaching on this passage ecologically, it's taking seriously the reality of that public facing work. And so
mhm,
one of the things so when I think about the last question, like where is the call to action for the church? One of the things that I think, Shannon, you kind of led us towards is how, as can your church community embody sustainable practices, like in what it is y'all do, like in terms of just how you, whether it be how you do worship, how you do your community meals, like everything, right? Where you buy your stuff, where you do your procurement. And so
mhm,
that's things that I've taken very seriously as an academic who's written books on on this. I feel like I ought to. And so like our church is default veg, like because we know the environmental impact that has with respect to the meat consumption. So we pretty much are. I mean, we're definitely vegetarian, but we're at the edge of vegan. I'm vegan, and so like because I think once people can see that you can actually have food that actually tastes good and that can be this, people are fine with it. And if you want some meat, just let me know. But otherwise it's probably going to be vegetarian with
mhm,
and half vegan at least. um and we have coffee, we have non-dairy creamer, like all those kinds of things. But it signals something to people even though we don't have any signs that says, oh, this is why we're default veg. Somebody asks, right? Visitors ask, "Oh, why do you have this?" And that's an opportunity for us to then tell them why we've made this kind of commitment as a congregation to live into our values, right? To
mhm,
say, how can we embody this practice in ways that isn't just having a sign outside or having something up, in our bulletin, but actually says this is why we do this thing, right?
mhm,
Our church tries to model this practice because we care about our planet, we care about our children and our grandchildren and our future children that we don't even have, right? We take this seriously that we love you even though we don't know you, right? We're doing this not just for us, but also for our community as well. And so for me, the call to action for people is to practice these things in ways that are public and authentic, but not performative. And
mhm.
that's such in our current social
Tricky.
media context, that is
Mhm,
slippery, right?
mhm,
That is
Mhm.
hard. So
mhm.
I don't want to pretend
Tricky,
that this is an
tricky. Yeah.
easy line to draw, but that's what
Mhm,
resonated with me when I read this Matthew passage.
But it's interesting listening to both of you. Shannon, thinking about your garden and the ways that people are attracted to it. And Christopher, as you're talking about the ways that you do food at your church, both of what you're describing are invitational.
Mm-hmm.
Like and maybe that's kind of the distinction here, is that when someone is yelling on the street corner, as the text gives us, and uh,
Mm-hmm.
telling us how holy they are, or telling us how sinful we are, there's
Mm-hmm.
nothing very invitational about that.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing that wants to invite me into the way of life and the way of practice that they're doing.
Mm.
There's something about what you're both describing that is inviting me
Mm-hmm.
into thinking about my lawn, thinking about the way I eat, thinking about the way that I am in the world, that um, I actually think is a model of how we are invited to Christ's table, that we are invited to be a part of what Christ is doing in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so maybe part of the call here is to find invitational ways. I also think about your pollinator garden, and I've seen this in my own garden of there are species of animals in my backyard now that weren't here 5 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
because of the 10 years I've put into tending the soil and growing certain plants and things like that. It has invited
Mm-hmm.
creation into my world, and in a way that
Mm-hmm.
it has not been. And thinking about what does it mean to have a invitational posture,
Mm-hmm.
as people of faith,
Mm-hmm.
that isn't condemning. It isn't the destructive theology that we were warning against when we're thinking about Joel.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it does sometimes, that invitation is into hard conversation. Sometimes that invitation is into things that are going to make us uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes the only way to get to those things that are uncomfortable is through an invitation, not through the blame, not through the judgment, not through the accusation, but through invitation. And that's a little bit of what I'm hearing, um, from both of your stories, kind of side by side.
Well, the healing comes in community, right? You can't, we can't be individual people upset about the climate crisis, or upset about, um, one of the latest terrible examples of it being the fires in LA. And unfortunately, there'll be a new terrible example any day now, right? I mean, that's unfortunately the space we're in, right? But if we are constantly trying to do individual pieces and not be in community while we're dealing with these, uh, acts, not, I want to say acts, these terrors that are going on around us, right? And then also all the other things that are going on in the world around us that our folks are dealing with, that we're dealing with as pastors as well, from the individual to the corporate, in society. If we try to deal with these things on our own, we're never going to get there. We have to deal with it in community, and of course, God's first invitations to us are invitations of community. The Trinity is a community, right? I mean, God, God's self is a community, right? In and of themselves. So, we are meant and for community, and I think that's the only way, um, we ever completely connect to the divine. I love being outside early in the morning and working in the garden, and people are walking by and they stop and ask me about it, or we talk about it. Or I had a neighbor one day walk over and say, "Oh, I really liked some of these purple irises you had, and I didn't have any purple irises in my garden, so I took them out and I swapped them, and I put some of my yellow ones in your garden." Like, didn't even ask me permission, but it felt so comfortable that she just, like, swapped the flowers. And now I've got, we've got some color in her garden and some color in my garden that wasn't there before. But I mean, I want people to feel that comfortable. Little kids come over and, pet the chickens in the middle of the day, and I hear them when I'm working outside. But that's a little community, but that's also, in the sacred part about being in congregational community is that you can work on these things together. You can talk about why would you choose to let go of meat, and talk about it as a community, or why would you choose to address big issues in certain kinds of ways. And I also want to say here in this passage, even Jesus is messed up here, right? I mean, at the beginning, Jesus is shaming the Gentiles. Don't be like them. Don't do this. Don't do that. This is when Jesus still hasn't gotten over his own human stuff of the xenophobia in his own community, and he's still parroting some of that from how he's been raised, clearly. And it isn't until later that he has this encounter with the Syrophoenician woman, and then he starts to have a different kind of feeling about the Gentiles, right? So even Jesus is doing this finger pointing himself at the beginning. And that's another good thing for us to name, that Jesus was human and divine, and Jesus is also still kind of getting his act together, even here. Which means we're allowed to still get our act together. So there's some grace there, I think, in it. There's so much in both of these texts. And I love, again, I'll say this again, I love that Lent is a season of repentance, because there's so much to work on. And community is the only healthy way to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think to kind of put a little bow on some of the things we're doing with both of these passages, and actually, Shannon, what you just shared about your neighbors and your relationship with the garden. To me, it's so much rather than a calling out, and this is kind of Derek what you were
Mhm.
gesturing towards as well. Um, and you're talking about being invitational. But Loretta Ross, womanist scholar,
Mhm.
talks about calling in, and I think
Mhm.
that's what we're describing.
Mhm.
Like it is a
Mhm.
calling in. Is it an invitation to say, hey, you know, I want you to be a part of this community, even when I notice you doing something that you ought not be doing. I'm going to invite you to your better self. I'm going to invite you in, right, rather than push you away, because none of us ever have changed and transformed because someone shamed us and made us feel bad. The way in which
Mhm.
we grow is because someone believes in us and says, "I know you better than this. I know
Mhm.
you want to
Mhm.
be better than this, and I want to
Mhm.
help you see there's something inside you that wants to be better than this." And I think that kind of calling in to me has to be rooted in love. And so that's
Mhm.
why when I talk about what my congregation has been able to do and grow and how I think this will be sustainable long after I leave, is because it wasn't like something I said, this is what we're going to do. I said, this is what I do. And this is
Mhm.
my theology around it. Let's talk about it. Let's make sure
Mhm.
we're on the same accord so we can actually be on the same page, and how they've
Mhm.
taken it much farther than I knew what they might want to do. Because
Mhm.
when you start applying it to its logical conclusion, they're like, oh, we need to start thinking about where we buy things and what we do in the companies we get things from. Because I work at a fairly large church, and so we have some capacity to make some demands on our suppliers, which has been a beautiful thing. But again, it's done in the spirit of love. And this is why I
Mhm.
think, and I'll close by saying this, why for me this comes back to having and I'm just that strange, leftist liberal Protestant who talks about sin. Because for me, being able to, like, so
Mhm.
it's Jim Keenan. I had to find the book. It's the title of the book is Jesus and Virtue Ethics. Um, and what he says in this chapter on the moral and theological reflections, the failure to bother to love, he's writing about sin. He says, in fact, throughout the Gospels, sin is often attributed not to obvious wrongdoers, but rather to those who do not bother to love. We can revisit the text that we mentioned at the beginning of this section. The parable of the rich man and Lazarus is about a man who never bothered to notice his brother at the gate, and so he is punished with hellfire. The guest who fails to bother with proper wedding garments cast outside to gnash his teeth. The Matthean judgment scene that separates those who saved versus those who are not, right? And basically he goes to say that it's often the reason we struggle with this is that when we're able to recognize when we've done something wrong, but we don't easily recognize our failure to love. And this is why we're often blind
Mhm.
to it. Like we don't easily recognize the
Mhm.
ways in which we could have loved more
Mhm.
unless we are asking ourselves that explicitly, where can I grow in love? And that's so much more invitational than
Mhm.
Mhm.
than saying, "Oh, you're a sinner." Right, as we see
Mhm.
Jesus saying, and like you said at the beginning of this passage, Shannon, like that's, oh, don't be like them. It's not so much, oh, you're a sinner. It's like, where could you love more?
Mhm.
Mhm.
Where could you love deeper? Where could your love transform you and move you, right? Like that's the way you get, that's why you pull people in, right?
Mhm.
By inviting them to really, because when you love someone in that way, it by its very nature pushes you closer to them, it transforms you.
Mhm.
And so that's where I see in this passage, like both of these passages, the call to action for our congregations is to love ourselves and non-human nature in ways that moves us and transforms us. And whether that be changing how you eat or how you congregation eats or where you get your food from or whether you that means doing some gardening or whatever it looks like for you, because I never want to put that on people because it's going to look different in different contexts. It does
Mhm.
requires it asks something of you, and this is the perfect time as a ministry leader to ask something of your congregation at the beginning of Lent. That's the whole point. Like we are going on a journey. Like it is the cost, as Bonhoeffer would say, this is the cost of discipleship. There is a
Mhm.
cost, and this is what it is.
Yeah. And I think this is why the liberal progressive wing of the church in the United States is so flat-footed at this moment,
Mm,
because
mm,
we have not taken sin seriously. We've said, oh, that's something our crazy evangelical brothers and sisters talk about, or that's some Catholic guilt thing over in that wing of the church. And so we've avoided the conversation about sin, which hasn't gotten us to the place where we can do love very well and invitation very well. And nobody wants to be in a community that isn't serious, right? And it doesn't allow us to say, really, we want to say, oh, we're progressive, we're liberal, we welcome everybody, we do this, we do that. Well, but what's the real why behind it? Because it causes harm. There's sin in that. Like there's sin in the unwelcome, there's sin in the harm of creation. And those things are an affront to God. And if we really want to love God, we've really got to get serious about naming and understanding evil, right? And sin, and how it's so warped and wrapped into us that we've just become so accustomed to it. And capitalism, of course, is like really our God in this country. Like that's our number one God is capitalism. And so, and that's created extraction and all the other pieces, right? We could go on and on about that. But I think if it's an invitation at the beginning of Lent to a community, it would be an invitation to like, wrestle with the hard stuff and wrestle with it in a way that's authentic, but helps us build a community that is attractional and tells a different story and tells a positive story. Um, and I think that's important. And it's also has the seed of healing in it as well. So I would be really excited to, if I was serving a church, I would be really excited about the season of Lent that's just about to happen.
That feels like a really good place to end. Shannan and Christopher, thank you so much for this rich conversation. I feel like I didn't really have to do anything for this. I felt like this kind of lets you guys run with it.
Yeah.
It was great. Appreciate your insights. Appreciate your invitation to preachers in this Lenten season to deal with the hard things, to go in the hard places, to be invitational in their message. I think everyone needs that right now. And so thank you. Thank you for this is an excellent way to kick off our Lenten season. Thank you both.
Thanks, Derek.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you, Christopher.
Thank you for joining us for the Green Lectionary Podcast. This episode was produced by Sprocket Wagner, and the music was provided by Christian McIver. Please like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and help us spread the word with a good review. You can support this and other programs of Creation Justice Ministries at creationjustice.org/donate.
Our story comes alive within these pages, for every time and place throughout the ages. God speaks and is heard, and the enduring word calls us to care for our world as we share the love that can set creation free. Restoring the earth to wholeness, peace, and harmony. Let the songs of the water, land, and sky resound, 'cause together we're we're all bound within these pages. There's always new life to be found.